Thank you for tuning in to Revive Recap. Throughout this podcast, we'll discuss different ministry topics taking place here at Island Church Galveston. Hello and welcome to another episode of Revive Recap. My name is Josh Pan. I'm here with Breland Martin. This week, we are talking about our 40th, or Pastor Leah's 40th anniversary service. He talked about, I know in the morning he talked about, he kind of just went over like years in ministry and different things that happened. All of it was cool because they all kind of revolved around God in his life and how God has just done so many miracles, right? And so, and then he talked a lot during the evening service, during communion, about speaking your faith. And so I think we're going to touch on that this week, just because, I mean, it's an awesome topic. There's so many sides of this mountain, so to speak. Like it never ends. So speaking our faith, he was in Mark 11 with Jesus and the fig tree. And, I've taught on this in the youth and even young adults, but it's so cool because he speaks to the fig tree and then he goes away. They go into the temple, they clean out the temple, right? Or Jesus does, because, he's like, you can't treat my temple like this. You're selling birds and whatever they were doing gambling, I guess, essentially. But back to the fig tree, actually, sorry. I guess at the time, the fig tree itself should have been producing figs, but it wasn't. And so he cursed it. Jesus actually cursed the fig tree. And so sitting back, you're kind of like, man, like he's Jesus. Why would he curse anything? But it's the idea that, certain things are designed to operate a certain way that God has created, and when they're not consistent with the way when they're not consistent with what God says about it, then we are allowed to say, no, that's not right. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So that's what Jesus did. He cursed his fig tree. He goes and cleanses the temple, or cleans out the temple, right? And then he comes back, and then and so at least a day had gone by. And that's when the disciples were like, whoa, Master, the fig tree that you spoke to withered away. Like what? And anyways, and so that kind of that sets the platform for, where's your faith? Whosoever shall speak to this mountain, when he prays, not when he, or when he says, not when he prays, or not when he, and so that Mark 11:23, a familiar portion of scripture, but he talked about speaking, and so much of that scripture revolves around what we're saying and what we speak into our situation. So anything that you wanted to add that you kind of remembered, or I'm just kind of setting the platform here for us to bounce off of.
Yeah. I think that the two services tied in really well together also when I listened to both of them kind of back to back, because in the morning he was talking, like you said, about his experience in ministry for the past 40 years and things that have stood the test of time for him in his ministry. You know what I mean? And then he talked about all of the, what's the word? The heritage that we have as his church body, in all the people that he studied under, all the things that he's seen and with God, and then talking about the things that he learned that kind of are the most important. And then he comes in and starts talking about your words, which it's interesting to me because I feel like it's a bit of a controversial thing in Christian circles now.
Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Like speaking to something instead of praying about something when it comes to your faith.
Most are is there even a difference? What's the difference?
Right, yeah. And I think, or I just don't hear a lot of people talking about confession or talking about, how it says speak to the mountain, not just pray about the mountain and tell God about the mountain over and over again. It tells us to speak directly to it. I just think it's interesting that it's controversial because I feel like it's very clear. He literally says, speak to the mountain and see it removed. You know what I mean? And that's the faith part of it. So I just thought it would be cool to talk about what that kind of looks like, or what exactly that means, because like I said, there might be people who don't know the difference, because I feel like it's not super talked about. It's very talked about at our church, obviously, but I feel
it's foundational here.
Right,
yeah.
But I feel like in a lot of places, when new people come in, we have an offering confession that we say every single time we give our offering. Like, we're speaking to our money, we're speaking over our lives. Sometimes people are like, why is everybody chanting all together? Like, what is this? But it's like, no, you don't understand. Like, we're speaking to this. We're using our words, mixing it with God's word and faith and stuff like that. So I just thought
No, I
that would be a
think
good way to
so.
go.
It's funny because you're explaining what I went through when I first came here. Because to you,
Sorry, that is funny.
I mean, it's hilarious because you're like, yeah, how did you not? And in my mind, I was like, yeah, how did I not? Like, get it. But in reality, I was one of those people. I remember hearing confession for the first time and being like, looking around, like, I didn't care because I knew God had already told me this was my church. But there was so much I didn't know just about speaking in general. And it's funny that we're talking about this now, but that was the first thing that God worked out of Kayla and me when we came to this church, and it was our words, how we're using our words. I read a book by John Osteen called The Power of Your Words. And because Pastor always talked to me, I was like, who's this John Osteen guy? So I got a few of his books, and that one, I mean, it changed my life. It's so funny because I love that God made that the first thing that I focused on, because that is something that foundational. It's something that everything else will be built off of.
It set you up well.
It really did, because for like 6 months, I mean, I'm just going to be honest, I came from the military, and even before that, like, I was cursing, everything was a joke, everything, like, and I had a pretty decent reputation in the military for just being really cynical but funny. And so there was an audience, like, it was, so I had to work, and I didn't realize that so many seeds had been planted because of the things that I was saying. I didn't understand that concept. I was like, it's just words. It's just, who cares? It's just gossip. Who cares, right? And so in going through that process for 6 months, it was so funny because Kayla and I were like the words police with each other, the faith police, really. It was like, oh, you can't say that, you can't. And we got kind of legalistic with it to where it's like, because you know what I mean? Because the idea is that as long as your heart, you have to be wary of what your heart is attached to when you speak, because there are some things where you're like, oh man, that was crazy. It's like, that wasn't really crazy, but you're also not, there's nothing backed behind that statement to create an atmosphere for that.
I'm not actually freaking out because it's so crazy.
Right. Exactly. But even that you have to be careful of.
Because what if you start freaking out?
Exactly. So it's this weird, but going from nothing to something was challenging for us because we had no check. We just thought you were supposed to talk a certain way because you're a Christian, not because of the power behind your words. And this isn't going to sound good at all, but we met a lot of quote unquote Christians that I remember we worked so hard to change our speech, and not because we were legalistic, not because, we thought that God would spank us or something like that, but we knew the power that our words held. And so recognizing that, you're very careful about what you say after that, coming from nothing, right? But we'd meet a lot of quote unquote Christians, and I'd be like, oh my goodness, like, why are they talking like that? But then I was like, is it me? Am I legalistic? And by legalistic, I just mean like Levitical law, right and wrong, like judging people for that. And that's really all legalistic means. It's you're judging people in the way God's supposed to be judging them, but you're taking that judgment yourself and pointing the finger. And anyways, and so in doing that, I remember thinking like, why are they saying that? Don't they know? Don't they? And it goes back to your point of saying a lot of people, even Christians, don't understand the concept of how your words have power in them. I mean, and there was something that you said, but it'll come back. But I was just gonna say the idea with words, and for those of you that are listening that may not, want like a crash course on this, but when God created the world, He spoke things into existence. And in the same, if you go to Mark 11, what we've been talking about, everything was revolved around the words that were spoke. Jesus didn't pull the fig tree out, uproot it, and then turn it over on its side or pour, Roundup on it and kill it or anything like that. He spoke to it, and He spoke a curse to it, because it and the thing is, the Bible says that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Whatever's in your heart, you're going to speak. But you also have to be careful, because blessing and cursing also come out of. We have the power to bless and curse, and it's not so I curse you, but it could be subtle, like, man, they're never going to get it, and it's like, dang, that's a curse. You just curse. Why would you do that, right? knowing what your words carry. And so I'm trying. It's really hard to talk about this and not go in depth. But the reality of it is, the reality of it is, we have power in our words. And I know you're reading a book too
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
goes into that.
It is. It's, I'm reading the Tongue of Creative Force by Charles Capps. And
Yeah.
it's really good. The most interesting thing about it too, I guess it's important to realize, foundationally, that it's a biblical thing. It's not something like we're like making up.
That's good.
Like, oh, if you say positive things, it's going to help you. Like, you might feel this way, but don't talk about it because that's not going to help you. Like, that's not what we're saying. Because I think it is important to be honest with God and to be honest about what you're going through. Like, you can't just lie and be like, no, I don't, But what the book talks a lot about is we don't deny that something exists. We deny its right to stay.
Right.
Basically. So
that's good, because
you see it as removed, kind of like the mountain. You see it as
right.
removed,
Like if I have a busted kneecap, I can't sit here and say you're not real and limp around and say, right. But you will find people that will limp around and call themselves healed.
Right.
But the reality of it is, it's not that the busted kneecap doesn't exist. It's like you're saying, but that's not the way God created me to be.
Right.
Jesus didn't pay the price that he did for me to have a busted kneecap. That's not. Exactly. And so you declare the redemptive
Which
truth.
is the same thing with the fig tree, too. It was like, it was not how God created it to be. And so it's super interesting. I liked what you just kind of said is what he was talking about on Sunday night with your identity, that he said the purpose of Jesus doing that, cursing the fig tree, was not because Jesus was like mad at the fig tree because he was hungry. Like, yes, he was hungry and it wasn't there and he couldn't eat, like, obviously, but that wasn't the purpose of him doing that. What he said in service was the purpose was for Jesus to show us the protocol and the way in which God works,
Yes.
God's protocol on how, what you're talking about, like the seed you're sowing with your words and how your words work. So Jesus was showing us that when we speak, it has an effect. And I think in the scripture it said, like, he said it and the disciples heard him say it. And then they all left. And then when they came back, the disciples were like, oh my God, this is crazy. Like, what's going on? And then, of course, Jesus is like, didn't remember when you heard me say that, Just like I said that, like, you can, if you have, like, faith, you can say to this, you can say to that, all these things, right? And so that's what I liked a lot that he was talking about on Sunday night, that Jesus was showing us that is the protocol that we're supposed to follow after. That's how God's system works. That's how God's, like, language works, and that we can't operate in the world's system of words and language of, like, speaking death whenever you feel it all the time and expect the results of God's system and God's protocol. You know what I mean? Like,
it's the same thing that God's been doing since the beginning of the universe. Like, he spoke. I mean, you go Genesis, and then he spoke, and then he spoke, and then he spoke. And it's so funny because for me, and I'm just explaining my and Kayla's, like, personal journey into understanding the power of our words. We were so loose leaf with our words that you didn't, and we can claim ignorance and naivety because we just didn't know. But as a believer, once you hear that, you then begin the process of being held accountable for what you say. Mm-hmm. And you can't say, I didn't know. We get taught these things. And so it's funny because you and I were talking about this, I think yesterday, but periodically you will have these moments where, or seasons, quote unquote, where you will be like, man, what am I doing with my words? And that's what, so in the book, John Osteen's book, The Power of the Tongue, one of the first lines in the first chapter is, you are a product of everything you've ever spoken about yourself up until this point. Mm. And that hit me like a hammer because I was like, what have I been saying about my life, about my wife, about my friends, about the food I eat, about my day? What have I been saying? And you really, like I said, you're at that point, you're held accountable, but not to as a constraint, but it should be liberating because if you're held accountable, that means if you only speak everything in line with God, or you attempt to, or you strive to do that, you get all the fruit, you get all the benefits. You talk about seed time and harvest. If our words are seeds, then what are we planting? And the reality of it is, if your life is garbage and it's terrible right now, and you're like, well, my job did this, and we can play the victim all we want, but getting that revelation, that truth in you will change everything, because you'll say, you'll say, well, that person, they're awful at work. I have the worst job. This person always does this to me. It's unfair. That may be true. It may be very unfair. And I'm not trying to make you feel bad about your situation, but what have you spoken and up until that point to create that environment? That Jesus said it himself, a bad seed won't produce a good fruit, and a good seed won't produce a bad fruit. It's just, that's the way it is. So what, and I don't know, I can be kind of militarian when it comes to things like this, because I'm like, people will come to me and say things like, well, this person, and it's a completely unfair situation. That person completely wronged them. But in my mind, I'm like, but they did the same thing to Paul, to Jesus, to Peter. Like, how did they get through it? As a Christian, why aren't we getting through it? Or what's your issue? And it's typically what they've been saying about it. It's, well, I mean, they're never going to change. I'm like, there you go, dude.
Right, yeah.
Or, well, it's just, whatever, insert excuse here. When you think, and the reason I brought all this up was the idea that now that we're held accountable, you can run into this rut. And we talked about periodically, it's growth. So the way you spoke last year, you can't speak this year if you're growing out of things. Yeah. And they're the same things that will try. Pride is the main thing. Pride is something that it takes a long time to get rid of. And just when you think you're rid of it, it's there again. So it's kind of, I hate to say ongoing, because it kind of paints this picture of this losing battle. But really, you have to attack pride head on. So that comes in the same way you have to attack your words head on. There are a lot of times where I'm done with gossip. I don't gossip anymore. And then all of a sudden, 6 months later, you're knee deep in it. Yeah. And you're like, how did I get here? I had such a revelation before of how bad this was. And now I'm operating, but that's growth. That means that you have to bring yourself to a higher standard. You have to bring it. And I say all that because a lot of people will come into this place where they mentally assent to those principles. Like even right now, those of you that are listening, you're held accountable now. Now you know the truth, right?
Now you know.
Yeah. But the reality of it is, what are you going to do with that revelation? Because if you leave it there, you will understand these principles, but you only assent to them mentally in your cognitive function, and spiritually there will be no revelation. Like, does that make sense? Like the confession thing for me, you can get to a point where you are just chanting it, where you are just saying scriptures, where you are just, use the busted kneecap. Yeah, I'm healed in Jesus' name. And your heart isn't in it. Yeah. There's no faith attached.
You're like waiting to see if God's going to do it.
Right, which is the same thing as not saying anything at all.
Right.
There's no merit to it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That came up whenever you were talking.
What I was going to say too, that's interesting, because you were talking about kind of your, if we don't have time, you can tell me, but your experience with like hearing that and learning that. It's funny because it's different from my experience, but some things are the same, because I think there are kind of like, there's two different types of person that you are, right? You either came into it, like you a little bit later in life is when you became a Christian, started learning all these things, and you have this relationship with God. And then there's people who kind of like grew up in it. That's how I am. And so I know what you mean when you say like you mentally assent to it, because you grew up hearing all the time the power of your words. Like I heard it all the time, but that didn't necessarily mean it didn't stop me from, getting into whatever grade I was in school and start cussing or start, you know what I mean? Like that, even though I knew, it's interesting too, because when you grow up in church, if you like fall off or come back or whatever, usually it's because someone's bringing you to church as a child or as a young teen or something, and because you have people speaking over your life because you're like a minor or a kid. And so for me, it's been the difference between becoming a young adult and having to come out from under people spiritually taking care of me, speaking over me, and come into my own. So it is sort of similar, because regardless of the fact that I've known it for a long time.
Sorry, that's wild.
I have to.
That's such a cool.
It's true.
Wow.
And everybody who has grown up in church and now is like my age, like I think of my friends who also grew up in church, like they get it too. If you have parents or grandparents or someone who obviously prays over you, has poured into you, like that's how it is. You know, you're used to not them carrying you, but it having a certain amount, like their words have a certain amount of guard over you
Yes.
for a long time, to where even though you're speaking, because you're under their authority, even if you're speaking bad, they're canceling stuff out with their like confessions over you. You know what I mean? So once you get to the point where you're a young adult and you're on your own, even though I've known it, I still find myself like having to learn. Like, yes, there were certain things I already knew, like I ain't gonna say that, but like fine tuning it and being like, okay, wow, now that my parents aren't here to pray over me, or my parents aren't, I don't live with them for them to be
Right.
able to
Well, spiritually,
have that,
you get to a
know?
point where they're not responsible for you.
Right,
You are
yeah,
responsible for
for
yourself
yourself.
spiritually. In other words, like they were teaching you how to hear from God, but now you hear from God.
Right. Yeah. And I think that that's obviously you're going to have to go through that. Everybody's going to have to go through that. Like when they move out or they get out from under
Right.
it. But I think words is one of those things that you have to kind of learn. And like you were saying, see, okay, wait a minute. Why do I feel this way? Or why am I always kind of doing this thing this way? Or why do I always struggle with this a little bit now that I'm on my own? You have to like self-evaluate and see
Right.
where you're at. And
There
even
were things that were accounted for that you
Yes.
didn't know were
we're
accounted,
accounted for until you're on your own. You're like, wait a minute, why is this harder? And then there are things that I thought were going to be harder that are not hard. And I'm pretty good in that area, you know? So it's like, it's still being a young adult and like figuring those things out, similarly to how you had to kind of like navigate and figure out,
Right.
okay, this is what we have to do. And I've even seen a difference. Like I liked how you were saying the way that you talk about other people or to other people. Like I've even seen a difference in the people around me when I change how I talk about or what I expect out of them, like expecting other people to do well instead of expecting people to mess up or
Right.
something like
Even
that.
as a
They've
joke.
changed. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's just, it's crazy.
That's, man, you opened up something, because I you know, my children are growing up in a godly household. I did not. Kayla did to an extent, but it was, you know, a particular denomination where God was around, but he wasn't there. You know what I mean? It's not, there's no relationship. It's the idea of knowing that he exists, but not having relationship. And so, in other words, in short, I was going to talk to the point of, you know, nobody's praying for us unless it was strangers that met us and things like that. But really, because
Yeah.
Kayla's, you know, family, we weren't taught how to pray. They were taught how to, you know, work the beads and, you know, cross and kneel and stuff, but actual prayer, like God, biblical prayer, and even biblical speaking, those were things they did out of habit, out of mental assent. It's just good to do this. It's just right to do this, but not out of a godly motivation through their heart to speak a certain way, right? So all that to say, we kind of came. You mentioned, I mean, there's just so much to unpack, but you mentioned it was so cool. You mentioned that you know, your parents were covering you and then making that transition into your own life, and so really, I would say for me, it was like I had been so inundated in the wrong things and sin, whatever, like drugs, alcohol, partying, pills, whatever, all of that, to where to me, I had experienced everything that I knew wasn't. I don't have to like guess
Yeah.
about like, whereas someone who grew up in the church that may have not necessarily been protected, but have just been, you know, that didn't entice them growing up. It's just because your parents are praying, the culture, the environment you grew up in, didn't experience a lot of that stuff. Now some do, I get that, but even, you know, my experience versus Kayla's like was very different too. And she didn't grow up in, you know, she grew up in a denominational household. But most of the reason she didn't do certain things was out of fear, you know, and not by a godly motivation or where they just weren't interested because God was more important type thing. And so all that to say, I think in my experience, the reason why it was so easy for me at an older age to make the switch was because I'd already been to the bottom of everything, and I found out there was nothing there. And so I think that in a godly motivated, you know, spiritually sound household, his design is that you don't have to do that. that you won't go through those experiences, that you, if prayer is involved, if you speak and you impart these things into your children, they may fall every now and then, but the extent at which is completely different than, what I went through. And the reason I bring that up is because I knew exactly what not to do because I'd been in it so long, and making the switch was, but that actually, there's potential for legalism in that, because I was like, I wanted to get everything right. So how do I put it? Like, to the T. Like, I was like,
Yeah.
okay, I can't say this, I can't do this, I can't do this, right? Because I came out of that environment, and I think that's dangerous because, shifting into that, you won't say anything. It got to the point where we really weren't saying much because we were so afraid, and that's not God's intention either. It's not a fear thing. He doesn't want you to be afraid because you do make slip-ups,
Yeah.
So, I mean, the only reason I bring that up is because there's like a happy medium, because you can go
Yeah.
from being completely reckless to way too careful. And when you're way too careful, what happens is you teeter-totter into indecision, and there's no faith there. There's no faith involved in that. And especially when it comes to your words, it was to the point where I was like, I don't even know if I can say that. And God's like, dude, like, if you let me in and you let me work through you, we'll purge all that stuff out, and then you'll begin to speak when I'm speaking. And it won't be motivated by fear, but it's time. I think that's the biggest thing, time and experience. He gives you the word, we take in the word, and then he gives you opportunity to act on the word. And that's faith 101. But when it comes to speaking, you speak throughout that whole process. You speak before it comes to pass, you speak while it's coming to pass, you speak after it comes to pass. And all of that, I think that's why he brought that up on Sunday. That was just such a big thing. It's the idea that you're always going to be using your mouth, and you're always going to be speaking. And if by God's design, your words hold a miracle, your words can bless and curse, man, you understanding that shouldn't hinder you. It should liberate you, type thing. I don't know. But that whole concept that you brought up with the kid, like, that's just crazy, because I'm realizing, I'm like, man, because I do pray over my kids, but I don't, it can't be in vain. It's the fact that I am spiritually responsible, but I'm also teaching them, that at some point you're going to have to talk to God. You're going to have to.
Oh, yeah. And my parents told me that so much when I was a kid. They're like, we're setting you up to do things on your own. Like, my parents were very clear about that for a long time, that everything they did, they wanted to set me up to be able to do things on my own. They didn't want me to be like super dependent on them, but that didn't mean that the moment that it happened, I was like ready to go. Like, you have to learn it and figure it out.
Yeah. As far as speaking, you mentioned friends. I like that because this is always an interesting area. But in when it comes to friends and things like that, we create our environment with what we speak. But I think that also when it comes to relationships, we also create our environment depending on how we choose to hear certain things, whether we allow certain things into relationships. All of that has to do with words, right? Like, you have to interact with people. God is not, you can't just be some like loner all the time, you know what I mean? Because God, it's designed that we reach people, so you can't do that, by not talking to anyone. So that relationships are inevitable. But when I say talk about friends, I know, before I kind of made the switch, had the revelation, I got, I decided to take God seriously. I had a ton of friends, and then it kind of like funneled, and mainly because, I just knew, not that I didn't like them or anything like that, but I just knew this isn't going to work for me. It's not going to work in the direction that I would want to go. I know we talk about gossip quite a bit. I think I had taught on this a couple Fridays ago, but gossip in general, why, I don't know, this is going to be an off the wall question, but why is it sometimes when we get familiar with people, why is it easy to slip into these areas where we're just not careful with our words? Why do you think? I mean, I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but I mean, I've often wondered that, like, even me and my wife, my most intimate relationship, there are times where I get comfortable, and if she doesn't check me, or if I don't check her, we enter into a thing and we're like, we shouldn't even be talking about this. Like, why?
Yeah. If I had to guess, I would say probably, to me, if I think about my closest friends or family, the reason that I feel so close with them is because I don't feel like I have to watch what I say and censor, and I can't say this around them or they're going to get this way or get this way. Like, you feel like you can relax and hang out. But then if you're not, like you said, I think that's why it becomes easy, because in all the other areas, like, if I don't like a movie, I'm not going to like, oh, I can't tell them I didn't like the movie.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because they might get upset. Like, no, if I'm with my friends, I'm going to be like, yeah, I didn't really like that movie, because they're not going to care. So in those ways that don't really matter, your guard is down. But if you're not, always kind of, I don't know if meditating is the right word, but always kind of having that in the forefront of your mind, then it can slip into saying things that you shouldn't say. And that's why I think I've noticed a difference with at least my friends and like how we all are. The more that we go to church together, talk about the things that are preached at church together, read books together that are talking about these principles, then we check each other and we watch each other, because we know, like, it's kind of like when we're like, now you know. Well, it's like, now we've all talked about it. We all know that we have to watch our words. So if you say something out of line, I can tell you type thing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's what I think.
I agree. I think we only have a couple minutes, so we'll finish with this, but I think that it has to do with overflow. If it's not in you, it won't come out of you. And if you're not careful of what gets in you, then your overflows, it's a product of that.
Right.
So we talk about the human body being dirt, right? I mean, even, from a chemical compound standpoint, when we are dirt, right? The same, carbon, phosphorus, whatever. I'm being a nerd, but I mean, that's what it is. So that means that we were made to create, that seeds were meant to be planted in us and we were made to produce. And I've often said this, we're made to produce that way. And obviously I'm speaking illustration wise, but when it comes to seeds and words, what things are you letting into you that are sprouting and growing and producing fruit in your life, bad or good? And that's what gets scary, because everyone wants to focus on the good. Like, well, no, I speak this about, yeah, but what are you watching? What are you listening to? And like I said, not to get legalistic, but there are things, I mean, just the other day, this is so crazy. I'm driving in my car and my phone updates, I guess. And so there's this thing now where every time I plug my phone in, the news comes on. I haven't listened to the news since like 2002.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
literally.
But it will play automatically. And and I try and cut it off quick. 5 seconds, Breland, I kid you not. 5 seconds, I heard one thing. And it kind of caught my attention, like, oh, and I start looking into it. And all of a sudden, I'm into this not while I'm driving, by the way, but I fall into this entire narrative that has nothing to do with anything, that has no bearing whatsoever. It didn't do anything but produce fear and questioning in me. And I remember thinking, that was 5 seconds.
Yeah.
I heard one phrase and I looked in it, and I had the ability in my phone to go in, right? So I say all that because we're living at a time where there's so many things that want to, that aren't godly, that want to just take hold of us and plant seeds in us.
Right.
And so bringing it back to the main point, I think the reason that we can fall into those things is when we don't have friends that check each other, when we don't have, we're not centering our lives around the things of God. Even in the Christian sphere, we talk about, everybody's a Christian, everybody's upstanding, but that's not true. I mean, even your friends or my friends or whatever, or family, I don't know what they do on their own time. Yeah. They'll tell you that and there are things that I don't want to know, what they're doing. But the reality of it is we have to create those environments, right? Like you said, where we check each other and things like that. But I think it has a lot to do with overflow. If every time you're talking to this person, friend or not, or whatever, and it's the same scenario, that's not God. God is about improvement. God is about a change of attitude. God is about being victorious. These are identities that Jesus died for us to partake in, right? Yeah. Partakers in the divine nature, not just spectators. If you have a person I call it going through a loop, because I've talked to people where like every 6 months, it's literally the same exact. It's like clockwork, where whatever they're going through is derived from the same issue that happened that I found out originally, about. Anyways, long story short, I think, it has a lot to do with overflow. I mean, yeah. I don't know. That question came to mind. I
Yeah.
just thought about like, why does it happen? But I think you got some really great points. Absolutely. I think it has a lot to do with centering yourself around God and keep staying around godly people. Though.
Yeah.
Anything you wanted to add, or
No.
because we're pretty much out of time.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. We will catch you guys next time on Revive Recap.